On December 3, 2022, 15-year-old Kai-Sean Pittman and 16-year-old Kimarian Wilder went to a birthday party in Toledo, Ohio. They had no idea it would be the last night of their lives. 12 days later, investigators would find their bodies inside the ruins of a vacant house. But between those two moments was a mystery involving a basement, a missing gun, a group of people, and a night that prosecutors said turned from retaliation into kidnapping and murder. And the most unsettling part? Just hours before they disappeared, Kimarian was still casually video chatting with his cousin. He was playing video games with Kai-Sean. Everything looked normal. Then the call ended, and the boys vanished. That evening, Kai-Sean and Kimarian attended a birthday party at Maumee Bay Lodge in Oregon, Ohio. At some point, they were reportedly seen with a gun and were asked to leave. Surveillance footage later showed the teenagers getting into a vehicle. But they weren't simply heading home. They were taken to a residence on Maumee Avenue in South Toledo. Around 8:52 p.m., Kimarian posted on Facebook that he was there with Kai-Sean. Then, everything changed. According to prosecutors, the teenagers were confronted over alleged thefts. One accusation involved a gun believed to have been stolen from Corbin Gingrich. Other allegations involved break-ins connected to people associated with the group. And what began as an accusation soon became a confrontation. Prosecutors said Kai-Sean pulled a gun and was wrestled down. The boys were assaulted and restrained. A photograph was reportedly taken while they were bound. They were taken out of the house. According to prosecutors, Kai-Sean and Kimarian were placed in the trunk of a vehicle associated with Charles Walker. And eventually, they ended up at a vacant house on Chase Street in North Toledo. But their families didn't know any of this. The teenagers were reported missing. And the search began. Then, early on December 5th, the vacant Chase Street house was set on fire. By the time investigators examined the property, the building had been badly damaged. But the fire had not erased everything. It would take another 10 days before investigators found what they were looking for. On December 15th, following tips that led police to the property, investigators searched the rubble, and they made a devastating discovery. The bodies of two teenagers. They were later identified as Kai-Sean Pittman and Kimarian Wilder. The boys who had gone to a birthday party 12 days earlier were never coming home. But investigators now had an even bigger question. Who had taken them there? Toledo police, with assistance from the FBI and other agencies, began reconstructing the final hours of the teenagers' lives. The investigation eventually expanded to 11 defendants, 9 adults and 2 juveniles. And investigators uncovered a wider context involving alleged thefts, robberies, and an illicit marijuana operation connected to several people in the case. One particularly important lead came from prison phone calls involving Kai-Sean's father. Those conversations helped investigators identify a person known as Cruz. As detectives continued working the case, attention increasingly focused on Charles Walker and Brent Kohlhofer. Prosecutors alleged the two men played a central role in transporting and killing the teenagers. But the defense disputed the state's timeline. They questioned the lack of DNA connecting the boys to Walker's vehicle. In May 2024, Walker and Kohlhofer went to trial. The trial lasted 9 days. The defense continued to challenge the evidence and the credibility of witnesses. But after hearing the evidence, the Lucas County jury reached its verdict. Walker and Kohlhofer were found guilty of aggravated murder in Kimarian Wilder's death. They were also convicted of murder in Kai-Sean Pittman's death and kidnapping charges. They were acquitted on one aggravated murder count involving Pittman. Then came sentencing. In June 2024, Judge Lori Olender handed down consecutive sentences. For Wilder's aggravated murder, life without parole. For Pittman's murder, 15 years to life. Other defendants received lesser sentences after pleading guilty to various charges. But the legal battle didn't completely end there. Walker and Kohlhofer appealed their convictions, continuing to maintain their innocence. Their appeals were unsuccessful, although post-conviction proceedings have continued. It's easy to get lost in the charges. The defendants, the evidence, the appeals, the courtroom arguments. But before this became a massive criminal investigation, it was simply the story of two teenagers. Kaishan was 15. Kimarian was 16. On the night of December 3rd, they went to a birthday party. They were asked to leave. They went somewhere else. They played video games. Kimarian talked to his cousin. And then, suddenly, there was silence. Their families spent days searching for answers. 12 days later, those answers came in the worst possible way. Two teenagers were found inside the remains of a burned house. The courts have since convicted people for their deaths, but no sentence can return Kaishan and Kimarian to their families. The case of Kaishan Pittman and Kimarian Wilder showed just how quickly trust can turn into something no one sees coming. But sometimes, the people closest to a victim aren't hiding a secret for days or weeks. They're hiding it in plain sight. In 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese left her home late at night, believing she was meeting two friends. She never came back. At first, her disappearance looked like a mystery. But investigators would soon discover that Skylar's closest friends were hiding something. And the truth behind that night would shock an entire community. At 12:30 in the morning, 16-year-old Skylar Neese climbed out of her bedroom window. A light-colored sedan was waiting outside. Inside were two girls Skylar trusted, her best friends. She got into the back seat and drove away. By the next morning, Skylar was missing, but investigators would eventually discover something horrifying. Skylar hadn't been taken by a stranger. The people who knew where she was were the people who had planned her death. Skylar Neese was 16 years old and lived in Star City, West Virginia. She was an honors student with a 4.0 GPA. She worked part-time at Wendy's. And she dreamed of becoming a criminal defense attorney. Skylar was also an only child. Her parents, Dave and Mary, were everything to her. And then, there were her two closest friends. Shelia Eddy had known Skylar since childhood. Rachel Schoaf became part of their circle in high school. The three girls appeared inseparable. They went to school together. They spent time together. They looked like ordinary teenage best friends. But behind that friendship, something had already changed. And Skylar didn't know it. On July 5, 2012, Skylar finished her shift at Wendy's and came home. Hours later, surveillance cameras captured something unusual. Around 12:30 a.m., Skylar climbed through her bedroom window. She walked outside and got into a waiting car. Shelia Eddy was driving. Rachel Schoaf was inside. Skylar had no reason to be afraid. These weren't strangers. They were her friends. But according to Schoaf's later confession, this wasn't a spontaneous late-night drive. The two girls had already planned what they were going to do. They had prepared supplies, they had knives, and they had chosen a remote location in Pennsylvania. Skylar was unknowingly being driven toward it. The girls drove roughly 30 miles into Pennsylvania. They eventually stopped in a wooded area the three had visited before. According to Schoaf's confession, Eddy and Schoaf told Skylar they had forgotten a lighter. Skylar got out of the car. She turned away. And that's when the two girls attacked. Skylar fought back, but she couldn't escape. The girls eventually left her in the woods and returned home. They changed clothes. They cleaned themselves and the vehicle. And then, they did something almost impossible to understand. They pretended nothing had happened. The next day, Skylar's parents reported her missing. At first, authorities considered the possibility that she had run away. There was no confirmed abduction, no obvious crime scene, and no body. Meanwhile, Eddy and Schoaf participated in the search for their missing friend. They posted publicly about Skylar. They acted as though they were desperately looking for her. The FBI and West Virginia State Police became involved. Weeks passed, then months. The case seemed to have reached a dead end, until Rachel Schoaf broke. In late December 2012, Schoaf suffered a severe mental breakdown and was hospitalized. After her release in January, she confessed. First to her lawyer, then to investigators. And she revealed what had happened to Skylar. She also told police where to look. On January 16, 2013, investigators recovered Skylar's remains from the wooded area in Pennsylvania. After 6 months of uncertainty, her family finally had an answer. But the answer was devastating. Skylar hadn't run away. She hadn't been abducted by a stranger. She had been killed by 2 girls she trusted. And now investigators had one question. Why? Schoaf initially described the motive in chillingly simple terms. She said they simply didn't like Skylar anymore. They no longer wanted to be friends. Later accounts revealed additional tension, including a secret romantic relationship between Schoaf and Eddie and concerns that Skylar might expose it. Whatever the precise motive, investigators concluded this wasn't an impulsive act. There had been preparation, a vehicle, supplies, weapons, a location, and a plan. Both girls were eventually charged as adults. Rachel Schoaf pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2013. She received 30 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 10 years. Shelia Eddy initially pleaded not guilty, but in January 2014, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. She received life in prison with mercy, making her eligible for parole under West Virginia law. But Skylar's story didn't end in the courtroom. Her disappearance helped lead to a change in West Virginia law. In 2013, Skylar's Law was signed. The law strengthened coordination when children are reported missing and requires earlier communication with the West Virginia State Police, so authorities can evaluate whether an Amber Alert may be appropriate. Skylar's parents became advocates for the law. They also created a scholarship in her name and promoted Skylar's Promise, encouraging young people to report threats of violence to a responsible adult. What makes Skylar's story so difficult to forget isn't simply how she died. It's who was sitting in that car. She didn't leave her house believing she was walking into danger. She left because her friends were waiting. The people she trusted most had already decided what would happen to her. And for months afterward, they helped search for the girl they already knew was dead. Skylar was 16, an honors student, an only child, a daughter. A teenager who wanted to become a lawyer. She should have had decades ahead of her. Instead, one summer night ended everything. But her name didn't disappear. Her story changed state law. Her parents turned unimaginable grief into advocacy. And Skylar became a reminder of something we don't always want to believe. Sometimes danger doesn't look dangerous. Sometimes it looks like a familiar face. Sometimes it sounds like a friend's voice. And sometimes it's waiting outside your bedroom window. Skylar trusted the 2 girls sitting beside her that night. That trust cost her everything. But the next case takes that idea somewhere completely different. Elise Poller left her home in Arroyo Grande, California. She was supposed to meet friends. Instead, she walked into a plan that had been forming around her. And when investigators finally uncovered what happened, they found that Elise hadn't been chosen at random. Someone had decided she would be the price of proving their loyalty. 15-year-old Elise Poller left her home on July 22, 1995. She believed she was going to spend the evening with 3 teenage boys she knew. She never came home. For 8 months, her family had no idea where she was. Then one of the boys involved finally confessed, and what he told investigators revealed that Elise hadn't been chosen at random. The people who took her had been talking about killing her for weeks. They had chosen a location. They had prepared for it. and they believed killing a teenage girl would somehow give them what they wanted. This is the story of Elise Poller. Elise was 15 years old and a freshman at Arroyo Grande High School in California. To her family, she was simply their daughter, a teenager growing up in a community where people knew one another. Nothing about her final day suggested that she was walking into danger. But 3 boys from her school had been making plans. Royce Casey, Jacob DeLashmutt, and Joseph Fiorella. The 3 were connected through their interest in death metal music and had formed their own band. According to investigators, their conversations eventually moved far beyond music. They became fascinated with Satanism and the idea of a human sacrifice. And eventually, they decided they needed a victim. They chose Elise. On July 22nd, Elise left home to meet the boys. She was reportedly told they were going to smoke marijuana and spend time together. Instead, they took her toward a remote eucalyptus grove on the Nipomo Mesa. It was an area the boys knew, a place away from the streets and houses. And according to later testimony, this wasn't an argument that suddenly went too far. The plan had already been discussed. They intended to kill her. Once they reached the secluded area, the attack began. Elise tried to fight back, but the 3 boys overwhelmed her. She was killed there in the grove. Then they attempted to conceal what they had done, and they went home. For everyone who knew Elise, she had simply disappeared. Elise's family waited for answers. Investigators searched for her. Leads were followed. The boys involved remained silent. For months, the case went nowhere. Then, something changed. Royce Casey began struggling with what he had done. He also became afraid that the other 2 boys might eventually turn against him. In March 1996, roughly 8 months after Elise disappeared, Casey confessed. And he didn't just tell investigators that he had been involved. He told them where Elise was. He led authorities to the eucalyptus grove. There, investigators recovered her remains. After 8 months of uncertainty, Elise's family finally had an answer. But the reason behind her death was almost impossible to understand. According to investigators, the boys believed a human sacrifice would give them power and make them better musicians. They had reportedly discussed the idea for more than a month, and they believed Elise fit what they were looking for. The case quickly became associated with Satanism and death metal music. But that connection would later become controversial. The boys' own accounts changed over time, and years later, their statements about the role of music and Satanism were not entirely consistent. What remained clear was that the murder had been planned. 3 teenagers had discussed killing someone. They selected Elise. They brought her to an isolated location, and they carried out the plan. All 3 boys were prosecuted as adults. Royce Casey, Jacob DeLashmutt, and Joseph Fiorella eventually pleaded no contest to murder. They were each sentenced to lengthy prison terms, ranging from 25 years to life. The case also became a national story because of the alleged connection to heavy metal music. Elise's parents later filed a lawsuit against the band Slayer, arguing that the band's music had influenced the teenagers. The lawsuit was unsuccessful. But the debate surrounding the case continued for years. Was music responsible? Was Satanism responsible? Or were these 3 teenagers responsible for decisions they had consciously made? The courts answered that question clearly. The responsibility belonged to the people who carried out the crime. Elise's case didn't disappear after the convictions. The 3 men eventually spent decades in prison. And decades later, the question of parole brought the case back into the public conversation. Royce Casey and Jacob DeLashmutt were eventually released on parole in 2025 after serving roughly 3 decades. Joseph Fiorella remained incarcerated and continued to face the parole process. For Elise's family, the passage of time didn't erase what happened, because no amount of time can change the fact that Elise was 15 when she died. It's easy to remember this case because of the headlines. the Satanism, the music, the unusual beliefs, the three teenage killers. But underneath all of that was a 15-year-old girl. The next case begins with a different kind of mystery. In 2009, Jason Sweeney was a young man whose disappearance left investigators with more questions than answers. He vanished. And for years, the truth about what happened to him remained buried beneath conflicting accounts, missing evidence, and a case that refused to disappear. Then investigators began putting the pieces together. And what they uncovered changed the story of Jason Sweeney's disappearance completely. 16-year-old Jason Sweeney thought he was meeting his girlfriend. Instead, she was leading him into a trap. Waiting in a wooded area in Philadelphia were three people Jason knew. One was his childhood best friend. The others were two brothers he knew. According to investigators, they had planned to rob Jason of his paycheck. What happened next would become one of Philadelphia's most notorious juvenile murder cases. Because the people who took Jason's life weren't strangers. They were teenagers, and one of them had been his best friend since 4th grade. Jason Keel Sweeney lived with his parents in Philadelphia's Fishtown neighborhood. He was 16 years old. He had left school to work construction with his father and was saving money for his future. Jason dreamed of attending Valley Forge Military Academy and eventually becoming a Navy SEAL. He had recently started dating 15-year-old Justina Morley. And one of his closest friends was 16-year-old Edward Batzig Jr. Jason had known Batzig since 4th grade. There were also two brothers in his circle, Nicholas Koya and Domenic Koya. To Jason, these were people he knew. He had no reason to believe that some of them were already discussing how to take his money. By May 2003, Jason was working construction with his father, and he had just received a paycheck worth roughly $500. According to investigators, that money became the target. The group allegedly planned the robbery days before Jason was killed, and they needed a way to get him somewhere isolated. That's where Justina came in. According to prosecutors, Morley was used as bait. She contacted Jason and arranged to meet him at a wooded area known as the Trails, near the Delaware River. He didn't know that three other teenagers were waiting nearby. And he didn't know that one of them was the person he'd trusted since childhood. On the evening of May 30th, 2003, Jason arrived at the Trails. Morley had brought him there. Batzig and the Koya brothers were waiting. Then the attack began. He pleaded with the attackers to stop, but they continued. The assault ended with Jason's death, and once it was over, the group took the money he had worked for, approximately $500. But what happened afterward would make the case even harder for investigators to understand. According to statements given during the investigation, the teenagers divided the money among themselves. Then they spent it on drugs. A 16-year-old boy had been killed for a paycheck, and the people responsible were already spending the money. Police began following leads almost immediately, and eventually, one of the teenagers started talking. Domenic Koya provided information about what had happened. That information helped investigators connect the group. All four were eventually arrested and charged as adults. Investigators determined the killing had been planned. This wasn't a robbery that suddenly became violent. According to the prosecution's case, the group had already decided what they wanted: Jason's paycheck, and they had chosen someone they knew to help them get it. But investigators also began looking beyond the money. Why Jason? Why go this far for roughly $500? And why involve someone who had been his girlfriend and someone who had been his best friend? Investigators and a forensic psychologist later suggested that money wasn't the only factor. There were allegations of envy and resentment. Jason was working. He was making plans. He had goals. He was trying to build a future. Meanwhile, some of the teenagers involved were struggling with drug addiction and instability. The robbery may have provided the immediate reason. But investigators believed resentment may have helped fuel the decision. and that made Jason's death even harder to understand. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone whose life they had watched developing. Someone they knew. Someone who trusted them. The case eventually went to court. In 2005, Batsig and the Koya brothers were convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, robbery, and related charges. They received life sentences without parole for the murder. Morley took a different path. She pleaded guilty to third-degree murder in exchange for testifying against the others. She received a sentence of 17.5 to 35 years. Morley was eventually released on parole in December 2020. But the legal story didn't end there, because all four had been teenagers when Jason was killed. And years later, changes in American juvenile sentencing law forced courts to reconsider some of the life sentences imposed on minors. Nicholas Koya and Edward Batsig eventually received resentencing hearings. But the courts continued to treat the crime as exceptionally serious because of the planning and violence involved. Life sentences remained in place. Jason's parents could never give him the future he had planned. But they found a way to keep one part of that future alive. They established the Jason Keel Sweeney Foundation. The foundation helped fund a full scholarship at Valley Forge Military Academy and College, the school Jason had hoped to attend. His dream became an opportunity for another young person, and that may be the most important part of Jason's story. But in the next case, the person at the center of the story wasn't killed for money, or for anything investigators initially suspected. 14-year-old Danica Troy left her home on an electric scooter while her mother slept. By the next morning, Danica was reported missing, and less than 2 days later, investigators would discover that she had been killed. The suspects? 2 teenagers she knew from school. According to investigators, one of them had pretended to have feelings for Danica to get her out of the house. What began with a message and a teenage disagreement would end with a 14-year-old girl dead. And investigators were left asking one question: what could have turned a school dispute into murder? Danica Troy was 14 years old and lived in Pace, Florida. Her mother, Ashley, described her as bold and fearless. Danica loved singing. She loved drawing. And she had grown up navigating challenges from the beginning, including surgery for a cleft lip. Shortly before her death, she had transferred to a new school after getting into trouble. She also had an electric scooter that she used to get around. To her mother, Danica wasn't a headline. She was her daughter. And on November 30th, 2025, Ashley had no reason to believe she was seeing Danica for the last time. That night, while her mother was asleep, Danica left home. She took her electric scooter. She was heading toward a wooded area off Kimberly Road in Pace. According to investigators, 2 teenagers were waiting for her: 16-year-old Gabriel Williams and 14-year-old Kimari Blevins. Danica knew them from school, and according to her mother, Williams had pretended to have a crush on Danica. That made the invitation appear personal. Normal. Something a 14-year-old might have accepted without thinking twice. But investigators later alleged that the attraction was an act. According to authorities, once Danica reached the area, the situation changed. The teenagers shot her. Investigators said Williams continued shooting after the initial plan was allegedly carried out. The two then attempted to conceal what they had done by setting the area on fire. They left Danica behind and went home. Meanwhile, Ashley had no idea where her daughter was. The next morning, December 1st, she reported Danica missing as a runaway. Search efforts began, but there was no immediate answer. Then, the following day, someone walking through the area made a discovery. On December 2nd, a passerby named Mitchell Edens found Danica's remains in the woods. The nearby electric scooter became one of the important clues. Her shoes also helped investigators identify her. But the discovery created a new problem. Police now had to determine who had brought Danica there. And why. The breakthrough came from someone who knew what had happened. A cooperating witness told investigators that Blevins had discussed the plan and the killing with Williams. Within days, both teenagers were arrested. Williams was 16, Blevins was 14, and investigators now had a case involving two teenagers accused of planning the death of another teenager. Police said the case began with a dispute during Thanksgiving break. Social media was involved. Danica had allegedly blocked Blevins. She had also reportedly made insulting comments about Williams. According to Sheriff Bob Johnson, those words did not seem to explain what happened, and that became one of the biggest questions surrounding the case. Was this really about an argument, or was there something else underneath it? Because people argue online every day. Teenagers fall out. Friends block each other. People say things they regret. But most arguments end with silence. This one ended with a 14-year-old girl dead. Investigators believed there was more to understand. On December 19, 2025, a Santa Rosa County grand jury indicted both teenagers. They were charged with first-degree premeditated murder involving a firearm. Both were being prosecuted as adults. They were held without bail. The case remained active as it moved through the courts in 2026. At this stage, the allegations against Williams and Blevins remain allegations unless established in court. But for Danica's family, the legal process is only one part of what they are facing. Because while prosecutors prepare a case, her mother is living with the loss of her daughter. Ashley Troy has spoken publicly about Danica since her death. She has said she doesn't hate the teenagers accused of killing her daughter. Instead, she has spoken about the influences she believes led them down this path. But she still wants the case prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And she has described Danica in a way that cuts through everything else surrounding the case. She said her daughter just wanted to be in love, 14 years old, a girl who liked singing, a girl who drew, a girl who rode an electric scooter around her community. And on the final night of her life, she believed she was going to meet someone who liked her. If you want to see where overlooked evidence can lead, subscribe to Crime Archivist. Danica left home believing she was meeting someone she knew. She never came back. But the next case begins with two young girls who were simply walking home from a school event. 13-year-old Abigail Williams and 14-year-old Liberty German went for a walk on a February afternoon. They expected to be picked up a few hours later. They never made it to the meeting point. The next day, their bodies were found in the woods near the trail. But before investigators knew who had killed them, they had something most unsolved murder cases never get: a video, a voice, and a few seconds of evidence recorded by one of the girls. That recording would remain at the center of the investigation for more than 5 years. And eventually, it would help lead police to a man who had already told investigators he was on the trail that day. This is the story of Abigail Williams and the Delphi murders. Abby Williams was 13. Her best friend, Libby German, was 14. The two were 8th grade students in Delphi, Indiana. They enjoyed sports, photography, and spending time outdoors. On February 13, 2017, they had the day off from school. So Libby's older sister, Kelsey, dropped the girls off near the Monon High Bridge shortly after 1:30 in the afternoon. It was supposed to be a simple outing. The girls walked along the historic trails. They took photographs. Libby posted pictures and a short video to Snapchat. And, for a while, everything appeared completely normal. Then came the moment when they were supposed to be picked up. They weren't there. Their families began looking for them. By that evening, Abby and Libby had been reported missing, and a large search began. Police officers, firefighters, volunteers, and members of the community searched the area. People who had known the girls were now walking through the same trails, hoping to find them. But as darkness came, there was still no sign of Abby or Libby. The search continued into the following day. Then, on February 14th, Investigators made the discovery everyone had been hoping they wouldn't make. The girls were found in a wooded area near Deer Creek, roughly half a mile from the bridge. They had been murdered. The small town of Delphi was suddenly at the center of a homicide investigation, and investigators had almost no idea who was responsible. But they did have one piece of evidence: Libby's phone. This is where the case changed. Libby's phone had captured video of a man walking across the bridge toward the girls. The image wasn't clear enough to immediately identify him, but it was something. Then investigators found audio. A man's voice could be heard directing the girls. Down the hill. Those few words became one of the most recognizable pieces of evidence in the investigation. Police released the image and audio to the public. They wanted someone to recognize the man. Thousands of people studied the photograph. People searched the area. Tips poured in. And the case became one of the most discussed unsolved murders in the country. But weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And the person in the photograph remained unidentified. The investigation grew. Local police worked alongside state and federal authorities. The photograph became known simply as the image of Bridge Guy. The voice became even more familiar. But knowing what the suspect looked and sounded like wasn't enough. Investigators needed to prove who he was. And then, more than 5 years after the murders, the case finally moved. In October 2022, authorities arrested Richard Matthew Allen. Allen was a Delphi area pharmacy technician, and investigators already knew something about him. Shortly after the murders, Allen had spoken with police. He had acknowledged being on the trails that afternoon. But at the time, he wasn't arrested. Years later, investigators returned to his name. And this time, they looked much closer. Prosecutors built their case around several pieces of evidence. There was the video recorded on Libby's phone. There was the voice. There was an unspent .40 caliber bullet found near the girls that prosecutors linked to a firearm associated with Allen. And then there were Allen's alleged statements. According to prosecutors, Allen made multiple confessions while in custody. Some were made to his wife. Others appeared in writings and recorded statements. Allen maintained his innocence. His defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence and suggested that other people could have been responsible. But the jury ultimately had to decide whether the evidence proved Allen's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Richard Allen went on trial in 2024, and after the trial, they reached their decision. On November 11, 2024, Richard Allen was found guilty on all counts. 2 counts of murder, and 2 counts of felony murder connected to kidnapping. Then came sentencing. On December 20th, Judge Fran Gull sentenced Allen to 65 years for each of the 2 murder convictions. A total of 130 years in prison. After more than 7 years of uncertainty, the Delphi murders had finally produced a conviction. But for the families of Abby and Libby, there was never going to be a verdict that made everything normal again. It's easy to remember Delphi through the evidence. The bridge, the photograph, the voice, the phone, the investigation, the trial. But before any of those things became evidence, Abby Williams was simply a 13-year-old girl spending an afternoon with her best friend. She went outside. She took pictures. She walked along a trail. She expected to go home. Instead, her final photographs became part of one of the most important investigations in Indiana. And her friend's decision to use a phone that afternoon preserved evidence investigators would eventually spend years trying to understand. Libby recorded the trail. She recorded the man approaching them, and without knowing it, she left investigators something that would remain important long after she was gone. But the next case begins with 2 teenage girls simply trying to make it home before curfew. On June 24, 1993, 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena were trying to get home. They had been at a pool party in Houston. They were running late, so they took a shortcut. It was supposed to save them a few minutes. Instead, they walked into a group of young men who were drinking near the railroad tracks. Neither girl would make it home that night. 4 days later, their bodies were found. And what followed became one of Houston's most notorious criminal cases. It would lead to multiple death sentences, years of appeals, and changes to the way Texas treated victims' families during capital cases. They were friends from Houston's Waltrip High School area and had spent the evening at a pool party. At some point, they realized they were going to be late getting home. Instead of taking the longer route, they chose a shortcut along the railroad tracks near T.C. Jester Park. It was familiar territory. The girls were walking toward Elizabeth's home. Then they encountered a group of young men. Among them was Peter Cantu and several others associated with a local gang. The group had been drinking. And what happened next changed two families forever. The girls were stopped by members of the group. What began as an encounter quickly became a kidnapping. The girls were taken away from the path and assaulted. Because Jennifer and Elizabeth were minors, and because of the nature of the crime, the details of the assault are difficult to recount without reducing two young girls to what was done to them. But one fact is central to the case. They were targeted, assaulted, and murdered. The killings were carried out by strangulation. The attackers then left the girls behind, and for 4 days, their families had no idea where they were. Jennifer and Elizabeth were reported missing. Searches began. Friends and family hoped they would be found alive, but on June 28th, 4 days after the girls disappeared, their bodies were discovered in the park. The investigation immediately became a homicide case, and detectives began working backward. Who had seen the girls? Who had been in the area? Who knew what happened? And why had two teenagers walking home become victims of such a serious crime? The investigation soon focused on the group of young men who had been in the area that night. Then investigators began getting information from people connected to them, and the case started to come together. 6 people were ultimately charged in connection with the murders. Their ages made the case even more difficult to comprehend. They were young men and teenagers. Yet prosecutors argued that the crimes were connected to gang activity and, in some accounts, a gang initiation. The defendants were prosecuted as adults, and the evidence presented in court established that Jennifer and Elizabeth had been kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered. The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred. It was who would be held responsible. The punishments became a major part of the case. Peter Cantu, Jose Medellin, and Derek O'Brien were sentenced to death. Efrain Perez and Raul Villarreal also received death sentences, but their sentences were later changed to life imprisonment after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that people who committed crimes while under 18 could not be executed. Venancio Medellin was 14 when the crimes occurred. He received a 40-year prison sentence. The case continued through years of appeals, and eventually, Texas carried out 3 executions. The case had now stretched across nearly 2 decades, but its impact wasn't limited to the people who went to prison. Jennifer and Elizabeth's families became advocates for victims' rights. They pushed for changes in Texas that would give victims' relatives greater recognition during the criminal justice process. One important change involved allowing relatives of victims to witness executions. The case also became part of a larger conversation about gang violence in Houston. Law enforcement officials later described the murders as an important impetus for expanded anti-gang efforts in the city. But none of those changes could give Jennifer and Elizabeth their lives back. Jennifer and Elizabeth took a shortcut because they were trying to get home. For the next case, the danger also came from someone the victim knew. 17-year-old Missy Avila thought she was going somewhere with friends. She didn't know that those friends had become angry with her. By the time Missy was found days later, the people responsible had already gone home. For years, the case remained unsolved. Then, someone finally came forward, and investigators learned that Missy's death wasn't the work of a stranger. It was the result of a friendship that had turned into resentment. Missy was 17 years old and lived in California's San Fernando Valley. She was young, surrounded by friends, and living the kind of teenage life where relationships could change quickly. But tensions had developed between Missy and two former close friends, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle. The source of the conflict involved romantic rivalries and rumors. What might have been a temporary teenage disagreement didn't stay that way. According to the case, the resentment continued to grow, and eventually, Severson and Doyle decided to confront Missy. But they didn't do it at school. They didn't do it somewhere public. They invited her somewhere isolated. Missy was asked to go with them to a remote area in the Angeles National Forest near Big Tuhunga Canyon. There was another teenager present. Missy went with them. She had no reason to believe she was walking into a plan against her. But once they reached the area, the situation changed. Missy was forced into a creek. She was drowned. Her body was then concealed beneath a heavy log. The perpetrators also cut her hair, and then they left. They returned to their lives. Missy's family was left wondering where she had gone. Missy was missing. Her family searched for answers. Investigators looked for leads, but the case didn't immediately produce the evidence needed to identify who was responsible. Days later, Missy's body was found, and now investigators knew they were dealing with a homicide. But knowing how Missy died wasn't the same as knowing why, and it wasn't enough to prove who had done it. The case eventually went cold. Years passed. The people involved grew older, and the memory of what happened remained with Missy's family. Then, after years of silence, a witness came forward. That changed everything. The new information gave investigators a connection between Missy and the people who had been with her that day. Attention turned back toward Karen Severson and Laura Doyle. The two women had once been Missy's friends. Now they were facing murder charges. The case that had remained unresolved for years was finally moving toward a courtroom, and the prosecution presented its case. Missy had not disappeared by chance. She had been taken to an isolated location. The conflict between the girls had developed beforehand, and the people responsible were people she knew. In 1990, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were convicted of second-degree murder. Both received sentences of 15 years to life. For Missy's family, there was finally a legal answer to a question that had remained unanswered for years. But a conviction doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't restore the person who was lost. Severson was eventually released on parole in 2011. Doyle was also released after serving time in prison. The two women who had once been part of Missy's life eventually walked out of prison. Missy never would. The case continued to have an impact long after the courtroom proceedings ended. It inspired a television movie. It became the subject of a memoir written by one of the perpetrators, and that memoir created another controversy. Missy's family objected to the idea of someone profiting from telling the story of a crime they had committed. Their advocacy eventually contributed to what became known as Missy's Law, aimed at preventing convicted criminals from financially benefiting from their crimes. For Missy's family, the issue wasn't simply about money. It was about who had the right to tell the story, and whether the person responsible should be able to turn someone else's death into a source of income. The details of Missy's case are difficult to understand because the people involved weren't strangers. They had been friends. They knew one another. They shared the same social circles. But somewhere along the way, friendship became resentment. Rumors became conflict. And conflict became something much more serious. Missy Avila was betrayed by people she once considered friends. But the next case takes betrayal in a completely different direction. 14-year-old Bobby Franks was walking home in Chicago when two young men pulled up beside him. They knew Bobby, and Bobby knew one of them. He had no reason to believe he was getting into a car with people planning to kill him. But Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb had already been thinking about murder for months. They weren't looking for money. They weren't acting out of revenge. They wanted to commit what they called the perfect crime, and they believed they were smart enough to get away with it. They were wrong. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb came from wealthy Chicago families. They were highly educated. They were intelligent. And both were fascinated by crime, philosophy, and the idea that certain people were somehow above ordinary morality. Leopold became particularly interested in the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche and the concept of the Superman, an individual who believed himself beyond conventional rules. Together, Leopold and Loeb began discussing something far more serious than philosophy. They wanted to kill someone, not because they hated the victim, not because they needed money, but because they wanted to prove they could commit a murder and escape detection. They needed a victim. And eventually, they chose 14-year-old Bobby Franks. Bobby was a neighbor and acquaintance of Loeb. That familiarity made the plan easier. They knew where he lived. They knew his routine. And they knew he would have little reason to distrust them. On May 21, 1924, Leopold and Loeb drove through Chicago looking for their opportunity. They eventually spotted Bobby. The boys approached him and offered him a ride. Bobby got into the car. Once they had him, the plan moved forward. Bobby was killed inside the vehicle. The two men then transported his body away from the area and attempted to conceal what they had done. But they weren't finished. They wanted the crime to look like a kidnapping, so they prepared a ransom note. The message demanded money from Bobby's wealthy family. If the police believed the boy had been kidnapped for ransom, Leopold and Loeb believed investigators would search in the wrong direction. It was supposed to be another part of their perfect crime. But there was one problem. They had left evidence behind. The investigation began almost immediately. Bobby's family was contacted. Police began examining the ransom demand, and investigators searched for the missing teenager. Then Bobby's body was discovered before the ransom plan could succeed. Now police were dealing with a murder, and they began looking closely at the people who had been around Bobby. That led investigators toward Leopold and Loeb. At first, the two young men appeared confident. They had believed their intelligence would protect them. But then, investigators found something that neither of them could easily explain. A pair of distinctive eyeglasses had been discovered near the body. The glasses were traced back to Leopold. That piece of evidence gave investigators something they desperately needed: a physical connection. The story began falling apart, and eventually, both men confessed. The perfect crime had lasted only days. Leopold and Loeb admitted what they had done. They also admitted the motive. There was no financial necessity behind the killing. The ransom was part of the deception. The real goal had been the murder itself. They wanted the satisfaction of committing a crime they believed ordinary people couldn't understand. And now they were facing the possibility of execution. But then one of America's most famous lawyers entered the case: Clarence Darrow. And Darrow wasn't going to argue that the boys were innocent. He was going to argue that they should not die for what they had done. The case became one of the biggest trials in America. The public wanted punishment. The prosecution sought the death penalty. But Darrow chose a different strategy. Because the defendants had pleaded guilty, there would be no jury trial determining guilt. Instead, the judge would decide their punishment. Darrow's argument centered on the fact that Leopold and Loeb were still young. He asked the court to consider their age, their psychological condition, their upbringing, and the possibility that they could eventually be rehabilitated. For days, he argued against execution. The case became more than a question of what Leopold and Loeb had done. It became a debate over something much larger. Should two young people who committed a deliberate murder be executed, or should the law leave room for them to change? Judge John Caverly ultimately chose life. In September 1924, Leopold and Loeb were sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder, plus additional years for the kidnapping. They had avoided the death penalty. But they would spend the foreseeable future behind bars. The decision became controversial. Some people believed Darrow had manipulated the court. Others saw the case as an important moment in the history of juvenile and criminal justice. And the story didn't end there, because prison would eventually separate the two men in a way their carefully constructed partnership never had. Richard Loeb remained in prison until 1936, when another inmate killed him. Nathan Leopold survived. After decades behind bars, he was eventually granted parole in 1958. He left prison and moved to Puerto Rico, where he worked and continued his studies. The two young men who had once believed themselves capable of creating the perfect crime had ended up with completely different futures. One died in prison. The other eventually walked free. But neither could undo what happened to Bobby Franks.
Gruesome, monstrous, and disturbing. These are the words I use to describe this murder investigation.
She was 13 years old. She had been reported missing. And 3 days later, firefighters responding to a fire at an abandoned house in South Carolina discovered something that would turn a missing child investigation into a homicide case. The victim couldn't even be identified visually. Investigators would eventually use DNA and dental records to confirm who she was. Her name was Kania Baker, and what happened to her would leave an entire community asking one question. How did a 13-year-old girl end up inside that house? Kania was originally from Sumter, South Carolina. At the time of her disappearance, she was living in the Columbia area while in foster care. She had a history of running away. That detail would become important. Because when Kania disappeared in January 2025, authorities had to determine whether she had simply left on her own or whether something much more serious had happened. She was reported missing on January 12. The following day, she was reportedly seen on Auburn Leaf Drive in Hopkins, South Carolina. Then, she vanished. For Kania's family and the people searching for her, the next few days were filled with uncertainty. Then, on the evening of January 15th, firefighters were called to a vacant house on Cardamon Court in Columbia. There had been a fire. The property was unoccupied. But inside, firefighters discovered the body of a young girl. The condition of the remains meant investigators couldn't immediately identify her. They needed another way to determine who she was. And that is where the investigation took a crucial turn. Authorities used DNA obtained from clothing associated with Kania's foster home. They also used dental records. The results confirmed the identity. The girl inside the burned house was 13-year-old Kania Baker. The coroner ruled her death a homicide. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. But for the public, one question remained unanswered. Who had taken Kania there? Police soon revealed something that made the case even more disturbing. Kania knew the people investigators believed were responsible. On January 18th, Columbia police announced the arrests of two teenage girls. One was 16. The other was 15. Both were charged with murder. Because they were juveniles, their identities were not publicly released. But investigators began revealing pieces of their backgrounds. Both were reportedly runaways. Both had left school. And one of the girls had already been wanted by South Carolina's Department of Juvenile Justice after allegedly removing her ankle monitor. There was another striking coincidence. She had reportedly been reported missing by her own mother around the same time Kania was reported missing. 3 teenagers, 3 lives intersecting. and one of them would never come home. Police also stated that Kania knew her alleged attackers, but there was an important piece of the puzzle that investigators had not publicly explained. Why? What caused three teenagers to come together? What happened between them? And what led to Kania's death? Kania was only 13. Her death also brought attention to larger issues surrounding vulnerable young people, runaway teenagers, and the challenges faced by children in the foster care system. People gathered to remember her. Memorial walks were organized. Community members came together near the area where she was found. And another event marked what would have been Kania's 14th birthday. She should have been celebrating that birthday herself. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Kania's story is how quickly a missing person investigation can change. Thanks for watching. Every case leaves behind a story of lives lost, questions unanswered, and evidence that refused to disappear. If you want more true crime stories where the smallest detail can change everything, subscribe to Crime Archivist. And if any of the cases stayed with you, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you think happened. Until next time, stay curious and keep looking closer.